Let's hit in now to our second panel conversation. Our moderator is Dr. Patrick Doran, the Director of Conservation Science at the Nature Conservancy in Michigan. Patrick?
Thanks, Christy. My name is Patrick Doran. I'm the Director of Conservation for the Nature Conservancy here in Michigan, where we work both in Michigan and across the Great Lakes on these wonderful issues about conservation and agriculture and water use. We had a great first panel there where we heard a little bit about the history of conservation, a little bit about the history of agriculture, talked about some current practices that are being administered on the landscape, and we ended up with a good discussion of approaches, but I think I'm left kind of with the question of the scale of the problem we're talking about, Great Lakes wide, and water quality and water quantity issues, as well as producing the variety of crops we see in this world. Does our current financing mechanisms, our current practices approach the scale of the issue? So with me today to kind of talk about some of those practices and policies are going to be Doug Busdeker. He works with the Andersons, where he is the area general manager for farm centers and plant nutrient group. Gail Hesse, Executive Director of the Ohio Lake Erie Commission. And Bill Schleizer, he's the Managing Director with Delta Institute. It's an organization that works on the economic and environmental sustainability of Great Lakes issues. So welcome here today, and I'm looking forward to the great conversation. Yes. Again, as Mary and her panelists ended up that first panel, we kind of talked about the different mechanisms and different ideas to help solve or help find win-win solutions between our need for agricultural production in this landscape and our desire for clean and healthy and plentiful water in this landscape. And I think key behind that are kind of discussions of sustainability, and oftentimes we hear this word sustainability tossed around. Like sometimes you can go to Home Depot and find wood that's got a marker on it, sustainably harvested or something like that. But what does sustainability really mean? Because we hear it from all different parts of the ag sector, of the conservation sector. What do we mean by sustainability? So.
Sure, I think sustainability is often referred to with reference to the triple bottom line, and that's often referred to as social, environmental, and economic prongs of a three-legged stool. I think the easier way to remember it is people, planet, and profit. But I also like to think of it in terms of, when I think about sustainability, is more than just sustaining, but also so that while each of those three legs can not only sustain, but also flourish.
So what do you think, Bill? What does that actually, can we get down to what's that really mean when we talk about the agricultural sector or the water sector of the Great Lakes?
Really creating a sustainable sector around agriculture, or any sector for that, is how do you put it all together to make sure that it makes sense for the people within that sector, for this flourishing that needs to happen, and making sure that you're really taking into account all of the consequences of those actions and decisions that are taking place within that sector. So how do you get the whole sphere around it in a way that makes sense, that it can operate ongoing and in a beneficial way?
So Doug, let's talk about this a little bit from the agricultural perspective. You work with a lot of farmers, you work on the ground, you've been doing that for many, many years. So what's that mean from the people? What from the people side of the equation, what is and how do farmers think about sustainability of their practices, of their business?
Well, that's an interesting question, because from a nutrient application standpoint, which is where I've spent most of my career, we talk a lot about the 4R nutrient stewardship program, and that's right source, right rate, right time, right place. And actually, from my perspective, I'm a ag retailer, which for many of your viewers may not know what an ag retailer is. We work with the farmers in recommending nutrients, crop protection chemicals, things like that. We don't grow the crop, we just help him do it better and produce a better crop. But this is our engagement with the farmer, is that we influence the farmer in what he does, and that's why our group as ag retailers has been an important part of this equation, because we do influence what he does. And you know, another thing when we talk about sustainability, the 4R nutrient stewardship program has been carried on a little bit further by the International Plant Nutrition Institute and the Fertilizer Institute, to include the social, economic, and environmental consequences of what we're doing. And that's the piece that's been added here recently. Actually, the 4R nutrient stewardship program is really not as new, but the 4Rs are really not new to agriculture. It's pulling it all together. You know, we talk about sustainability, utilizing our natural resources, in my mind, so that they're compatible with the social, economic, and environmental consequences of what we're doing.
So what are some things a farmer would look like or look at or measure to call him or herself sustainable from the economic side, for instance?
Well, certainly he needs to be profitable. That's one of the first things that he needs to do. Minimizing his environmental footprint is another big piece of that. And certainly we know from the discussions earlier, as well as the science, technology, what we know today, that the farmers contribute to the nutrient runoff out here. And I think most farmers are engaged and becoming more engaged in trying to reduce that runoff off their farms. And that's a very important issue.
One of the things I'd like to add to that is that what we usually see is that I have to give up yield to be more environmentally sustainable, but that actually doesn't exist, and there are opportunities to create programs where those two actually go hand in hand. It's not a this or that situation. There are solutions out there where you can have both.
So Gail, you also mentioned the social side of the equation. What are some things you'd look at and say, you know what, I am socially sustainable?
Well, I think none of us want to see the algal blooms in Lake Erie that we've seen, and we don't want to see the impacts to our water resources, so that there are beach closures due to algal blooms, or whether it's bacteria, or whether it's due to the algal blooms. So there's a social side from the standpoint of how we use our water, but looking at, again, sort of integrating the integration part of it that Bill spoke to, I think is important for all of that. And we all appreciate our water resources, not only from the economic engine that they provide in and of themselves, but for Lake Erie is a drinking water source for 11 million people around the lake. So there's the beneficial uses of the lake, but it's also the social, which is a social benefit, as well as the recreational uses, as well as the shipping and the tourism, and all of that kind of plays into the social side.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit earlier, I think with Doug, about how the position of the farmer is part of the community and as a steward of these resources too, and maintaining that position and understanding is also very important.
I'd like to add to that, as we listened to Terry speak here a little while ago, the legacy of many years of the family farm. That legacy is important to every one of these farmers out here. And I've never met a farmer after my whole career spending with a farmer that his objective was to leave the land worse than what it was when he came. He wants to leave it better for the next generation, whether it be his family or someone else that may be taking that on. But that message comes through loud and clear continually. Right. They want to leave it better than what it was when they received it.
So I think that's a really nice overview, kind of those three prongs, the social, the economic, and the ecological. We're going to go to a video here in just a second that's going to kind of talk a little bit about sustainability, and then we'll come back and kind of dive into a little bit more where we see pressures from sustainability coming.
Agricultural influence on water quality has become one of the key issues on the minds of residents in the Great Lakes Basin. How our food is grown impacts the rivers we fish, the water we drink, and the beaches we swim at. What happens on the farm is increasingly becoming a public issue.
If we're going to have the interests of the public looked after, for example, the Lake Erie beachgoers, the Lake Erie fishers who get impacted by algal blooms, we need an intermediary to represent those interests, and historically that has been our government.
While government funds have put a lot of conservation practices on the landscape, the symptoms of agricultural pollution still persist. Computer models are helping scientists understand how much more work needs to be done to reach the ecological conditions of a healthy Great Lakes basin.
So now what we're able to do is we can set an ecological goal, and we can actually say, what will it take in terms of habitat conditions to achieve that goal? But more importantly, what will it take in terms of the actions of the conservation community, the investments we need to make to achieve that goal? And so basically the conclusions that we've reached are that we have to either significantly increase the conservation provision of the Farm Bill, or we have to develop new and innovative strategies for getting more conservation on the ground and getting it on the ground more strategically.
We see more and more products in the grocery aisle that boast sustainability, and consumers are beginning to value this in their food products. Competition in the marketplace can help drive change in the way our food is produced and how it impacts the Great Lakes.
The real leverage to change behavior or modify behavior is through that private sector. It's through all of the transactions that occur in the food system. There are two ways that people get to vote in this country. They get to vote on the first Tuesday in November at the ballot box, and then they get to vote with their dollars every time they spend them.
If they value certain outcomes, then they buy from those companies that produce those outcomes. And the reality is, if you buy from those firms prosper, the other firms that aren't doing it notice, and they start to emulate those behaviors.
And there are win-win opportunities where being environmentally green can help the brand of a company and help its sales. And we've seen various examples of that in the past, and I think there will be more of those in the future.
And what that's forcing companies to do is not only re-examine their customer, but to build a supply chain that makes sustainability inevitable. And that's the real challenge, and that's what companies are now doing.
Consumers have the power to make sustainability a staple in our food systems. Companies embracing conservation practices at the base of their supply chains can greatly offset the influence of agriculture on fresh water. Healthy rivers and lakes are important to the region, but it takes governments, businesses, farmers, and the Great Lakes public working together to create a food system that protects these freshwater resources.
Thank you. That was a good overview video of sustainability, as well as trying to get into a bit different portions of what we call the supply chain. I think in the first panel, Albert mentioned this idea of kind of a systems approach, and I think you mentioned it, Bill, too. It's all of these things, these three different legs of the stool. But I guess the question to me is are we seeing more of a push and pressures and drivers towards sustainability? Has there been a change in the last 10 years about how much sustainability is kind of in our face, and why has that been?
I would say that there's been a huge change. When I started working at Delta about 9 years ago, we had to beat down people's doors to talk about sustainability and what it meant to be sustainable. And now we get the calls about how do I become more sustainable? What does that mean? I think we've seen it from all aspects of society, from business itself being a driver of sustainability, through programming and labeling of those types of things. We've seen it from governments trying to create new policies and regulations for more sustainability, and from citizens themselves starting to realize the real impacts that we're having on the environment around us. I think that we've also helped see this change in the last decade because we dealt with some very severe, visible environmental things a couple decades ago, put in an environmental framework, and then it kind of went out of sight for a while. But there's nothing better than green paint in Lake Erie to show people that we still have issues that we need to solve around sustainability.
I think that's absolutely right, and certainly the reemergence of the algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie has been a huge wake-up call. The reemergence of the algal blooms began in the mid-1990s, but then we've had a couple of really, really bad years.
I just saw this year was a little bit worse than they had predicted.
That's correct, but nothing nearly as bad as what we saw in 2011. And it's also from the standpoint of you never want to waste a good crisis, because that really was a wake-up call from the standpoint that it really raised not only awareness, but raising the questions about where and why where is it coming from, and the notion that what's coming off the land is very much integrated with what's happening in the water. And so it's that land-water interaction that people are starting to understand on a whole new level now, particularly in Northwest Ohio. And so really making those connections, and that really is a driver for how do we think about those three prongs of people, planet, and profit.
So Doug, farmers have always thought about sustainability. They've had to, but have you seen pressures increased? Or I guess it's also kind of from that systems perspective, there's the farmer in isolation thinking about him or herself, their own property, and maybe some neighbors, but is it also kind of putting themselves in the perspective of the whole watershed, of the whole western Lake Erie?
Good question. I think one thing that we can keep in mind that, with climate change, with a lot of the other environmental things that are going on around the country, that has raised this all to another level. And so that's brought it to, you might say, a precipice where we need to address things that maybe we didn't 30, 40, 50 years ago. You think back today, a little less than 100 years ago, most of this land was being farmed with horses. And today we're working with some of the most technological equipment that there's ever been. And it's tremendous what our American farmer has been able to do and what his production is. He feeds a lot of folks in this country as well as around the world. So sustainability is is continuing to be right at the top of our list of things to address.
And we're starting to be able to really understand it through the data and the technology. I remember my dad's a potato farmer in Wisconsin. The first piece of technology he had in his tractor was the portable DVD player that we got him for Christmas so that he could watch movies when he was out on the field. Now it's laser-guided GPS systems, precision agriculture. There's all of these new technologies out there that help make stewardship on the land so much smarter.
I like to think it's about bringing the science of water resources together with the science of agriculture. And while in the past they may have been separate disciplines, but really now the conversation is very different. And as we learn about what's happening in our water resources, connecting that with the science of what's happening on the land with regards to our agricultural processes.
I think another thing that really raises the awareness, there's only about 2 million farmers across the nation. And when you think about 350 million people in the country, it's a very small percentage of those folks. So it's easy to be in the public's eye, no doubt about that. So that makes it very important to do the right thing. And our farmers, I think, are dedicated to do the right thing. Now, as technology changes and the science grows, we're finding out we're needing to do some different things. And that's what this is all about.
So in the video, we saw mention of the supply chain, and I think, Doug, you mentioned you used we all, and we've talked about the technology and the producers and the farmers. So there's this idea of the supply chain out there. Could you define, or Doug, just kind of define the supply chain and the different parts of the supply chain? How do we get from the farm through all the various other avenues that eventually end up where?
Well, actually, if you were a farmer, everybody here is a customer. Everybody is a customer. And the farmer starts, and particularly in northwestern Ohio and major portions of the Midwest, it's a corn and soybean production area, some wheat, and there is livestock and so forth. So most of the grain goes through livestock or through ethanol production. Soybean goes into a variety of things, soy oil, livestock feed, as well as biodiesel and things like that. So the crops that our farmers are producing really go through that process. In most cases, it's not direct consumption. It'll probably go through livestock, and then it will reach the dinner table for the consumer after it's gone through livestock. And that's kind of how that progresses. The farmer produces his crop, he hauls it into the Andersons in many cases, and we distribute that grain into either ethanol or into livestock feed, that type of thing.
So I think that's a good perspective. So it kind of makes me really think that there's lots of different points in that supply chain and lots of different players in that supply chain, which can be part of a solution. So who in the Great Lakes are the different players? Who are some of those stakeholders that you work with at Delta?
Well, we directly work with farmers themselves because they are the ultimate steward of the land.
The delivery mechanism.
Right,
The ones
and they really are the problem solvers as well. It's really fun working with farmers and talking with what they do on the land and how they can pivot on a moment's notice. Imagine going to your office, every day, and then you just typing away on your computer and it just starts pouring on you. We sometimes...
That happens in my office sometimes.
You might have to have that looked at.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
But they're really the ones. And then you have all of the people that farmers work with. You have the conservation districts, you have the NRCS staff, you have USDA, you have the crop advisors and the ag retailers. And there's a whole support network there that really at that field level make those crops come up every year. And then moving down, you have the distributors and the processors and the people who then turn those products into something else, either for consumption or for a product. And then at the end of it, you do have the consumers who do buy whatever is being produced.
And so who are some of our major industries and corporations in the Great Lakes that we work with? Andersons, obviously.
Well, there's many grain operations, various companies around. But as far as the ultimate consumer of the grain, not the end customer, but the grain, there's various large livestock operations throughout the region. To name those, I probably can't do that right now, but there's a number of folks out here that do receive that grain, as well as the Andersons have their own ethanol facilities to produce ethanol.
So it's Gail, you work with the Ohio, on the Ohio Phosphorus Task Force, and reports coming out very soon that's going to make a recommendation about reductions of phosphorus entering the lakes. Can you just talk to us just a little bit about that?
Sure, this is phase 2 of the Ohio Lake Erie Phosphorus Task Force, and our report is being released tomorrow.
Oh, excellent.
Newsflash. And one of the recommendations in there is to establish some targets for the western basin of Lake Erie. And so targets for what sort of levels or amounts of phosphorus do we think we need to reduce by in order to see a change in the algal blooms. So the targets are set so that it would be approximately a 40% reduction in the total amount of phosphorus that we're seeing at the mouth of the rivers. So at the mouth of, in particular, the Maumee River coming into the western basin of Lake Erie. So sort of that total accumulation of that loading coming in from across northwest Ohio as measured at the mouth of the Maumee, at the Maumee River. So approximately a 40% reduction in the total loading.
So we heard good discussion at the end of the first panel, I think, from Alberts and Paul talking about kind of a base delivery mechanism through some of our federal funding, some of our federal programs. But again, I think we're oftentimes left with the question of, to get to a point of this 40% number, are we going to be able to get there based upon those programs alone? And one of the reasons we're here today is kind of talk about other delivery mechanisms of which you all are part of. Earlier, Doug, you mentioned 4R as a program and a policy and a practice that a lot of the suppliers and the nutrient managers are undertaking. Can you basically tell us right off, what are the 4Rs? Can you define those for us?
The 4Rs is the right source of crop nutrient, right rate, right time, right place. Let me talk about each one of those individually. Right source, there's a variety of different nutrients and how they are made that are available to the farmer to use. Some are more compatible with certain environmental conditions than others, certain climate conditions than others. The other thing on the right rate, we want some assurance out here that farmers are using the right rate of the nutrient for the crop production that they're producing. We could over-apply very easily. Now, generally speaking, that does not happen because of the cost of nutrients. Nutrients are very expensive for the farmer. And most farmers are working with some kind of a soil testing program that determines what they have in the soil, and then they determine what they're going to grow, and then they determine what nutrients they need to apply. You have an issue of a build-up, maintenance application, or a drawdown application based on what that level is in the soil. So that's how we build our nutrient programs around that. The right timing. Timing is critical. You can put this on at the wrong time. And particularly with nitrogen in the Maumee watershed or the western basin of the Great Lakes or Lake Erie, nitrogen is not real compatible with fall application. So we delay this until later to what we call side dress, and it's put on actually once the crop is up and through the ground. When you start talking right placement, is that on the surface where it can run off, or is it injected into the soil? So there's a variety of things that go into that whole process and the 4Rs.
So then you mentioned those are the 4Rs, but there's also the idea of being certified in those 4Rs. So what does that mean? How does that work?
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. That's a little different than just the 4R nutrient stewardship concept. It's kind of conjoined together with that. But in Ohio and Michigan and Indiana, we have members on a committee from the Agribusiness Council of Indiana, the Michigan Agribusiness Association, the Ohio Agribusiness Association, that we've been working, and many retailers as well as other interested parties. We've been working for almost 2 years to develop a certification program for ag retailers. This is not a farmer program, this is for ag retailers. And it's basically a program that goes through an auditing process that will give us some assurance that that certified retailer, if they become certified, are doing the right steps to reduce nutrient runoff and enhance what they're doing and making sure that they're doing the right thing.
So following those 4R guidelines. So
exactly.
What's the incentive for a retailer to become certified? Why would they want to? Why is it good for their business to be certified?
First place, it's the right thing to do. And there's a lot of folks in agriculture want to do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. And our farmers are the same way. They'll do what is the right thing to do. Now there's always the outliers. That's obviously the case in all businesses. But we think that there's even an environment, or let's say a competitive advantage to being certified. That if you're doing the right things, the farmers that want to do the right things are going to work with the people that want to do the right thing.
Gail, what do you see discussions of this coming out as an emerging strategy, emerging incentive that's in addition to kind of the traditional farm bill incentives?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where I think we're in the midst of a huge phase shift in terms of how all facets of the agricultural industry have really stepped up in unprecedented ways. I mean, I think the government subsidy and cost share programs have an important role. As well as in state government and our university extension programs. Those are all vitally important and are doing incredible work. But where so much more can be gained is as the industry has really stepped up and it's taking on these and other initiatives that I think will really make a difference on the landscape.
So, Bill, we've heard that's a neat mechanism, that kind of certification mechanism, but we've heard of other language. Some people say pay for performance, or sometimes you'll hear water trading, or sometimes you'll hear all different kinds of terms. And I know you're involved in a project up in the Green Bay area. If you could describe us that project a little bit.
It's in the Milwaukee River Watershed, and it's really taking these ideas of we have a target that we need to hit, and how do you create the tools that the farmers need on the ground to actually make that happen.
So in Wisconsin, there is a phosphorus target that is being required.
Right. So there's actually, it's kind of interesting. There's a couple things going on in Wisconsin and around the Great Lakes where people are thinking about this. One way is how do we use the conservation programs that are out there already better so that we can be more strategic about where they go on a field, so that they actually have real reductions. That you could put a buffer strip in one field and have no net gain environmentally, but you could put one in a different place on that field and reduce, runoff considerably. So how do we use this new technology and actually quantify the benefits of these practices going on a field-by-field basis? In Wisconsin, what they've done is they've passed the Phosphorous Rule. The Phosphorous Rule allows point sources who are the ones where it's the wastewater treatment plants. They're the ones with the pipes who have been under Clean Water Act regulation for several decades now, and continue to be the ones where you focus because we have the mechanism already. They have the option of reducing some of their phosphorus requirements on their permits through upstream activities. Okay. So this would be working with farmers directly to reduce that phosphorus loading that's happening on the field level. And what we're doing is to put the program together. How do you quantify the field reductions? How do you work downstream with the point sources? Because at a point source, it could cost hundreds of dollars to remove a pound of phosphorus from their system because of the way that they're set up already. On a farm field, it could be tens of dollars. Oh, wow. Okay. So you have this huge incentive to really innovate upstream in a wider and disaggregated area. But how do you create the system to have the trading mechanism make sense both for the farmer and for the people that are under compliance regulations downstream?
And so there's really a benefit to both of them. There's another financing mechanism, another income mechanism for the farmer, but it's also well worth the money for the factory or the treatment plant.
Well, hopefully it is. Otherwise, we'll have another program without a demand driver.
Right.
This is one of the exciting things, is that this regulation in Wisconsin right now is a demand driver. And what we've seen in other markets, we've had experience in agricultural carbon markets as well, is where if the driver goes away, you no longer have a sustainable revenue source for the implementation of these practices, which is key.
So have you heard kind of the applicability? Do you think these types of practices can be broadly applicable across the Great Lakes or in various states, or is there unique drivers in that instance?
No, I think there's opportunity in many areas. And Ohio has had a pollutant trading program for several years, but it was absent the driver with nutrient criteria for our streams. And so that was one of the key missing drivers that was needed, but now that's changing. And so we expect that trading, I think, will take on a greater prominence in the state of Ohio for the same purpose as a point, not point source of pollution type of trade-off.
So where are you with that program? Are you still kind of in the study and design phase, or is this being implemented?
We're not implementing yet, and it's very exciting. And what we're trying to do is, the other thing that we're trying to do with this program is, the farmer is now the decision maker on the field. So what is the tools that we can give them for their farm planning practices so that it's not prescriptive, so that it is a flexible mechanism, so that they know what's going to work on their field versus I can't tell them what's going to work on their field. So it's really engaging them because they like being the ones who are solving the problem. So if you say, I'm going to pay you this much if you can reduce the phosphorus coming from your field, tell me how you're going to get there. And then I'll sign a contract with you for that.
Yeah. So Doug, we also earlier, I think we were talking about kind of precision agriculture in the first panel, and I think you mentioned it too with your dad moving from the CD player to actually having a really nice GPS. But so how does those types of technologies that are being developed, those save the farmer money on the input side as well, right?
Yes, it does. Maybe before I go to that point, I want to digress just a minute back to the 4R certification program, because the one thing I wanted to mention that is actually a partnership between ag retailers and the Nature Conservancy, and that is a great partnership that the Nature Conservancy really came to the ag retailers to develop this certification program, and they have provided just a tremendous amount of leadership in that.
Well, thanks. I think what's neat when I've been hearing these discussions is all the right players are in the room, and if we start at the very beginning with knowing who those stakeholders are throughout the supply chain, and getting all those people in the room at the very beginning to hatch these ideas, use their creativity, and bounce those ideas off, that you have a much higher likelihood of success.
Yes, and to talk a little bit about the precision ag approach to farming, and it's kind of interesting, many of the folks here would have iPhones, many of you may have iPhones, and when you think about the mapping that you can do on an iPhone, the GPS and so forth, it's that technology that we're using in farming. And how's that technology being used? There's multiple things that are being done, all the way from harvest data, that when a farmer goes through the field, he's registering his yield on a 10 or 20 foot increment in the field, and that creates a map of production on that farm. Another thing that is being done is variable rate planning, where seed is being varied on the go based on soil types. Very high level of technology with that. Fertilizer application, nutrients are applied based on variable rate, based on soil types and soil tests within the same field. And that's something that, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't have. We could not do that. And so we can be much more precise in our nutrient application based on the soil type in smaller geographic areas.
So Gail, I think I've seen a couple themes we've mentioned. Is there's variability, there's all kinds of variability, and almost every parcel is unique in its ecological characteristics and its social characteristics. So I guess kind of asking the question is going back to that systems perspective, I guess it's important to have these variety of choices from the practices you actually implement in the field, but also these variety of financing mechanisms or drivers as well.
Sure, because it's all part of the picture. I think it's also important to acknowledge that there are still some unanswered science questions about what's happening out on our landscape in terms of the causal factors related to the algal blooms. We know it's dissolved reactive phosphorus. We know that 80% of the land use in Northwest Ohio is agriculture. We know that we are seeing, obviously, nutrient runoff. But looking at how phosphorus moves through the soil and into our streams under varying conditions, under different practices, a variety of conditions, there's more that we need to learn there so that we can become more prescriptive about which practices where, and again, under what conditions and at what scale do we need them so that we can see a difference in our water resources.
And how much is needed to get to that
Absolutely.
40%? And actually, how much is it going to, how much funding do we also need to get there? Because it's going to be scary if it's a difference if it's $1 million problem or a $10 million problem or a $10 billion problem.
And we're doing that in the face that not every agricultural field is the same. Not every agricultural producer is the same. There's different decisions and choices being made on fields every year, based on crop rotation, tillage systems, all kinds of factors are involved in what an agricultural producer needs to do, and for that crop for that year. And so we can't paint agriculture with a single stroke of the brush. There's too much diversity, too much complexity, and I think we're learning more about the science of that and how that interacts and interfaces with our water resources.
So Doug, where do you see some of the science gaps in this movement from the fields to our aquatic systems?
Well, we're just starting to really learn how that's really being transported, and particularly with the edge of field study that's going on in Ohio. As we gain more knowledge of what's there, this will affect the practices going forward. There's no doubt about it. And the one thing back to this 4R certification program, and I hate to keep digressing back to that, but the one benefit with that certification program is that it's a conduit to get the information out. Because I said earlier, as an ag retailer, we don't make decisions for the farmer. All we do is influence him. But we're a conduit to get information to that grower.
So I think what's interesting to me, some people when they talk science, or the discussions I have around science are very like, it's the ecology, it's the chemistry of the system, but there's also the social science and there's the economic science side. So what do you see as terms of gaps or information on the economic side or the incentive side of the equation?
You know, it's bridging all of this together. There's so much data out there, but getting it all in one place, and everybody talks about big data and how it could be good and bad, but really there are some gaps. There are gaps of really understanding how farmers make decisions on their fields every day. We're finishing up a study where we actually played games with farmers to kind of understand, you know, what's under the engine when they're making these decisions about subsidy or cropping patterns, or if they're going to take an incentive, who should the incentive come from? How should it be cast? And there are still some holes in economic valuation of both on the environmental side. I think we've got it down on the agriculture side of the yields, the inputs, but what we're missing sometimes is the outputs coming out of that and how you create the value for those that can then be incorporated into the decision-making process.
So if I could ask you, Doug, to look kind of 10 years down the road on some of these incentive programs like 4R and certification, where do you think it might be 5, 10, 20 years down the road?
Well, I'd like to think in 5 or 10 years that's just the norm.
Yeah.
That's we're implementing the new technologies as rapidly as they can come to us.
Right.
And that's what I would hope to see.
And do you think you'd expect to see some of these water trading mechanisms or projects or programs in place? Or obviously
I
you're
hope
hoping
so,
there.
yeah. It would be great. We need to find out what the right drivers are to promote really the financial mechanisms to influence these systems. You know, it could be that yield is the most important thing to a farmer, but if you can add on additional incentives to that to make the decision a little bit different. Well, if I do yield this way, I'll get this. If I do yield this way, I'll get something plus a little bit. You know, so I think there are some things that we can continue to do to see this roll out with nutrient management and other conservation practices, where they're really getting the value for what they're doing on the land. That's for the actual performance of those things.
So sometimes I worry, Gail, looking to the future is that the whole game changes and the whole field changes. And we have, you mentioned climate change earlier, that we've seen changes in rainfall patterns in the springs of the year when fields were traditionally not planted just yet. We're seeing warmer lakes, warmer Lake Erie. We see changes in aquatic invasive species that are changing the chemistry of the lake. So how do you account for all that change when the whole underlying system is changing, but you're also implementing all these new programs and projects? And
well, far be it from me to make any climatological predictions for the next 5 or 10 years, but I do think in 5 or 10 years we will be in a vastly different place, because I think what we will know will be enormously different. Again, as we bring together the science of agriculture and the science of water resources, as we have this edge of field research that's going on, that's going to yield really important information for us, that we're in the midst of, one, not only knowing and understanding that, but also integrating it so that we can make better decisions more effectively, and management decisions in concert with all of the people, planet, and profit prongs, so that we're all flourishing. But
so this seems like an exciting time to be at this nexus
I really
of
think
ag
it
and
is.
water.
It really is. It's really creating the tools that are going to really impact those
right.
decisions on the ground, and how you put them all together in a way where it's efficient and effective. We work a lot with the quantification models that are out there for agricultural environmental impacts, and there's so many models out there. It's like, which one do you choose? So we need to create these flexible tools where you can bring in this data to really help make good decisions.
And so, Doug, I guess kind of getting to me from the science side again, is that all that information sharing and again, this vast, this big data world that we are going to be living in and are going to be living. So how do you see the exchange of that information from all those different parts?
Well, there's many avenues that gets exchanged, and certainly today we're in the social media phase, and as well as the internet and everything else. And there's a tremendous amount of information that is shared in that fashion, as well as through our state associations, our state organizations, the Ohio Farm Bureau, Michigan Farm Bureau, Indiana Farm Bureau. All of those folks are a conduit. And information, sometimes we think we get information overload,
right,
you know,
right.
but it's a matter of gleaning through that what's really important,
right.
what really works, and will have an impact.
Yeah, I guess what's interesting to me is you have creative people at all different parts, and they start to acting, as we said earlier, kind of a whole systems perspective, and seeing that come together is really going to be the interesting part of what's happening in the next number of years.
And we all have voices that we trust, and
Right.
so part of the social science of this too is figuring out there's a whole range of those voices. Who are the ones that any individual listens to on any sort of regular basis? How do we process that information and then make our own decisions and judgments around that information?
All right, well, I think we're just about up, but we have some time for some audience questions, so let's go to the audience and see if you guys can handle some questions from this tough audience.
Can we say
I don't
no?
know about that. My name's Gary Towns. I'm with the Michigan Steelheaders, and formerly DNR, formerly MDA. So got a little background in some of this stuff. One thing I haven't heard talked about too much is the handling of manure on concentrated animal feedlots. When you have hundreds or thousands of animals in one spot, they produce a lot of manure every day. And what do you do with that in the wintertime? That's a big question. On frozen ground, is that applied? And this actually is one of the big things that a recent study has shown to be one of the causes of phosphorus and eutrophication of Lake Erie. So when are we going to, of course, the logistics of that very issue, how much is produced and what do you do with it over the wintertime, leads to containment facilities, very expensive containment facilities and those kinds of things. Do you think our society will become informed enough to drive the cost share of those kinds of facilities to help with that kind of a situation? It's going to be expensive.
Right.
It's funny, whenever we're putting our heads together at Delta, it's amazing how often it comes back to poop. It really, really does in a lot of these systems that we work in. It's a growing concern, and I think this is one of those areas in agriculture where we are starting to see a lot of movement around the research of technologies to handle this. Right now, we are at a place where it is expensive if we're going to deal with this issue instead of just putting it out back where there's ice and snow and everything. But I think it is going to be one of those topic areas in the future that's going to be really moving forward.
Doug or Gail, you have any comments?
Well, that's interesting because, and I'm not certainly an expert in livestock waste or manure by any means, but I know there's a lot of activity in Michigan, Ohio, in trying to help manage those farming operations and trying to dispose of the waste properly so that it does minimize the surface runoff. In Ohio, there's actually some legislation that's being developed that will cover all kinds of animal feeding operations. Most of the large operations were covered a few years back.
By permit, by a regulatory
permit.
program. I think I would just want to comment that the questioner made the point about it being a driver for the algal blooms in Lake Erie, and I think that that's not necessarily the case, and really how much of a driver it is dependent on the individual watershed that you're in. The Ohio Lake Erie Phosphorus Task Force in the first report identified that it was less about animal manure when we looked at the total inputs going into the system, in that it represented only about 27% of what was land applied versus commercial fertilizer, which was over 60. And so again, it's just the fact pattern is different depending on which watershed you're in terms of how much of a driver that particular source will be or can be.
Yeah, Bill, do you see, getting back to poop, do you see that kind of, it seems to me there can be some innovative technologies and businesses built around that, or byproducts that also can be monetized. Do you see those types of discussions?
Yeah, you definitely do. I mean, anaerobic digestion to create biofuels and products that actually can be reapplied to fields in a different way are definitely out there, and it is a growing field, and we see a lot of startup and investment capital going into those sorts of things.
Right. And I guess I was also fascinated by the water management technology too. It seems like that's going to be an integral part of the solution about the timing of application, being able to manage that water flow in and out. So where do you see that kind of going in the future as well?
I'm not sure about your question.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess some of
question.
that real-time management of the water systems, of the drainage systems, and kind of synchronizing that across the landscape too. And again, it's not just an isolated farm-by-farm approach, but it's going to have to be a regional, almost watershed-based approach.
Well, imagine a system where you have your drain management, and you know that there's a front moving in, and you're getting one of those good Midwestern storms, and then it relays to the technology on the field to shut your drains down, and then opens them up field by field as it passes so that you have better flow into the natural streams. That's a possibility out there. I mean, right now we're in this phase where we're really trying to find out what will work and how, and then kind of building it as we go.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I guess I see it's really interesting to look at all the different incentives and the programs and the policies of different ways to bring in new streams of funding to get these practices done. So thank you all very much.